So this shaping work, which before might have been only really dominated, let's say, by product and design, or really 90% product and design, becomes much more technical because we understand we have to know what we're getting into before we make a commitment to build it, right? So the shaping work becomes more technical than it was before. But then what's interesting is it creates this opportunity because when we shape a little bit better, then that means that fewer time bombs are exploding inside of the delivery cycle. When fewer time bombs are exploding, the product managers don't have to run around trying to fix everything, right? And what it means is that on the product side, we get more time. We get more time to focus on the strategic questions, which means then that our bandwidth increases for the framing work, which we always are talking about. You know, every product conference, it's basically like, how can we be taken more seriously by the business? And how can we be more strategic? And of course, the problem is that everyone is just running around all the time trying to put out the fires. And of course, there's no time to be strategic.
Hey there, welcome back. My guest today is Ryan Singer. Ryan and I met in Madrid last year, and after meeting him, I knew I wanted to pick his brain at some point on how he sees the world of product development. So I'm very, very happy to finally share this conversation with you. You see, Ryan's work is incredibly important to understand. There are so many golden nuggets in Shape Up, the book he wrote in 2019, explaining how they approach product development at Basecamp. And I wish more teams and companies would reflect on some of these principles and some of these ways of working. So we talked about all of these practical concepts and also the overall philosophy that Ryan advocates for in Shape Up and why it's important. So without further ado, I bring you Ryan Singer. Ryan, we are live. How are you today?
Doing great.
Nice. Such a pleasure to see you again since last time, and really, really happy to have you on the podcast. In 2009, you wrote a book about managing software. Is it 2009?
2019.
2019, yeah, Jesus, I was like 2009. That sounds really old. Yeah. 2019, you wrote a book about managing software development called Shape Up. Stop running in circles and ship work that matters. And we've talked a little bit about this in Madrid when we met, but what inspired you to write this book, Ryan?
It wasn't my idea. I was at 37 Signals at the time, and I had been there for already at that time maybe 15 years or something like that. And Jason, the founder, of 37 Signals, he said to me, "You've got to write this book." It had been kind of a long-running process of figuring out how to explain things that we were doing when we ran projects and why it was that we were able to kind of repeatedly ship things at the time and quality that we wanted to. And I had been kind of in this process of trying to figure out how to codify it and how to explain it. And it reached a point where he said, like, "You've got to write a book about this." And I wouldn't have done it otherwise. So I'm glad that he had that idea.
That's awesome. So it came from the way you were doing things in Basecamp, but also because you were doing some workshops on the side, as far as I understood, to understand the pains that were going in the market. Or did you do that after you got the idea from Jason that, hey, you got to write a book? You started collecting this sort of feedback in a way of how folks are doing product and the pains they're having.
So when Jason suggested I write the book, this was in 2018. I didn't think, well, now I have to go do research in order to figure out what goes into the book, because what we were hoping to do was to share what we had figured out, like what really was working in practice for us, working on Basecamp all those years. And but you're right that I did end up doing some research before I actually wrote the book, and that was because there was a big, as a product person, you understand, like, I had the technology, but I didn't understand how other people would relate to it or kind of why they would care. So I knew that we were doing things in a different way, and I knew that it was working well for us, but I didn't understand kind of what was going on at other companies and what problems they were having and why they would be interested in this book. So I didn't know how to structure it, like what should come first and kind of what should be the angle of how I explained the reasons for things. I
Mhm.
mean, we had just been doing this for years and years and years. And for me, it was just the way we worked, So I
Mhm.
needed that contrast between the outside perspective and how we were working. So I did a workshop where the idea behind the workshop was, well, I don't know how to write a book, but I do know how to give, I can talk for a day. So I did a workshop, and the idea was basically that I would teach how we work, how we shape projects, and kind of all that stuff around how we run our product development. And then the research part of it was, so I just gave the workshop, and then when the workshop was over, I interviewed the people who paid to attend the workshop, and I
Mhm.
interviewed them kind of using a job to be done method around like why did you go to all this trouble to fly to Chicago and pay $1,000 and sit there all day to hear me talk about how we shape work, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that enabled me to get the perspective I needed basically to actually sequence and the
Mhm.
material, so it was like some kind of a format in a book where it would make sense, and then once I
Yeah.
had that, then I did 10 interviews, and then I felt like I understood kind of how to structure this, so that then it was just a matter of putting it into book form.
And I can imagine how valuable that process was because the book came up in a very simple structure. So it's very well structured, in my opinion. And you structured into shaping, batting, and building, like three main broad areas. And before we get into the key ideas of Shape Up and your key ideas that you usually talk about, that I think resonate with a lot of folks, certainly resonate a lot with me and my approach to building products as well. Before we tap into those ideas, why don't you walk us through these three main categories and what it means, like shaping and batting and building, so that we build some foundation for people that are listening so that they can understand better kind of the content of the conversation moving forward. So let's start with
Yeah,
shaping. What,
sure.
what, what do you mean by shaping?
hmm so you know uh, what's happening today, if the people who are listening are delivering work on time, and at the level of quality they want, and there's no pressure from sales or from the CEO or from the business side or whatever, there's none of this feeling of like, why aren't we finishing things? Well, then you don't need something like Shape Up, then everything is fine. But if you're having those challenges with why isn't stuff done, why is it that projects keep going longer and longer and longer, why is it that everything kind of, it's like everyone is busy, but nothing is actually adding up to something where we say like, okay, now we get to finish it. Now it's really done, and we can move on to something else. Uh, when we talk about shaping, we talk about shaping because it's often kind of it's kind of like what's not happening. So, if you think about it like this, um, let's say that we say we're going to finish a piece of work in the next month, right? Well, then the amount of work needs to fit inside of that time box of a month. And if there's too much work in a month, you know what I mean? Then obviously we're going to have a problem. And what happens is usually we don't shape the work to fit into the constraints that we have. We usually kind of start with a lot of exploration, and then maybe there's a Figma file or there's a brief or there's something that kind of tells us what we're going to go build. And then the technical people are just supposed to estimate it. They're just supposed to say, well, how long is it going to take? So we start with a design and a kind of scope that's already fixed. And now all we get to do is attach a number to it. So that's like having like a fixed scope and variable time, right? And the idea of shaping is, let's turn that around. Let's say if we're actually supposed to finish by a certain day, let's say we're going to work on something for 6 weeks and we want to reach a business outcome. Sales is going to get that feature that they're waiting for, or the CEO is going to get that thing that he's been asking for, or whatever it is. Then if we want to actually finish at the end of that time box, then we need to vary the scope so that it fits inside of that fixed time, you know? So when we say shaping, what it really means is making trade-offs and making different choices about the design of what we're making, including the technical design. Just like if you wanted to buy a house, you could say, well, I want a four-bedroom house with three bathrooms and a garage for three cars. And you know what I mean? We could say that. But then there is a real budget of how much we can afford, right? And when you buy a house, you don't just kind of start with your dream house and then work backward. You say, well, this is how much I have, and let's look at the market, and then you start to understand maybe one bedroom, maybe two bedroom, maybe this neighborhood, maybe that neighborhood, right? We have to fit the work to fit to the constraints, you know. So that's what shaping is about. And you know, in a lot of teams today, there's you know, these different kinds of agile processes and Scrum processes and stuff like that. And there's a lot of kind of individual pieces of work moving through those systems. You know, there's user stories, there's tickets, there's these different things, but they're all kind of like disconnected little pieces of work, and they're kind of all supposed to add up to that big thing sometime in the future, right? And shaping is more about, let's get together and actually work out the concept for what this thing is as a whole, you know, and not as a bunch of individual tiny little pieces of work that we hope will come together, you know, into the bigger thing. So that's kind of what shaping is about. And this when it comes to let's jump to building. Building then is, well, what does it look like to be inside of that time box now? If we've shaped the work, how is it different? You know, if we have just a bunch of tickets, then in the best case, you know, we're getting those tickets done. But the thing is that every ticket is only one little piece, and nobody is really looking at how it all fits together, right? So there's a lot of questions about what does this mean and what does that mean? There's a lot of missing context. And usually what happens is it kind of looks like we're making progress because one ticket is getting done after the other. But then when we come to the end of the cycle or the end of the sprint or the end of a few sprints, all of a sudden when we try to really test how is it all integrating, then there comes a point of like, well, it's not coming together the way that we thought it would, you know. And then we're going backwards, or we're ripping things up and we're making changes, and the scope is getting bigger and bigger, all these different things, you know. And of course, a lot of times that's in the best case, and a lot of times what's written in a ticket maybe doesn't even really correspond to what is technically possible. You know what I mean? There's the Figma file that looks really pretty, but then when it comes time to build it, it's like, we can't actually do it like that. Or this doesn't actually deal with all the conditions we have to deal with, you know? Or the ticket is really fuzzy and it's like, well, they said they wanted it we wanted repeating events, but what does that actually mean? Right? And then there's so many things that weren't clear in the scope of what that actually was, right? So normally, because all these problems are happening inside of the time box, when the clock is ticking, you know, then everybody is under pressure and everything is late and everything is taking longer than we thought and people are blocked on each other. All the stuff kind of that we know, that we see all the time. If we do more of that shaping up front, where we have more clarity around what's in and what's out, so that there's a clear technical idea of what we're going to wire together and how it's going to do the job inside of the time that we're going to have. And if everyone can kind of see that big picture of the whole, then when they're inside of that time box together, when the builders are inside of that time box with the ticking clock, now they can actually use their judgment. They can make decisions themselves. They understand how it all fits together. So what you see is the team is able to take kind of more responsibility for the work. They can work more autonomously, and they also get to do more problem solving themselves, which means both that, of course, it's more fun. You know, it's more fun to work like that. And it also means that we get a better outcome. It means that you know, when we start to reach the end of that time box, that we're actually landing the thing that we intended to land, and we're coming to a conclusion, and we're actually going to release something that we're happy about.
Okay, so just before we get into betting, then let's just unpack. There's so many great things you just said that I want to touch on. So this estimate versus appetite idea, I think that's crucial, and I think it's a beautiful idea. It's basically shifting, instead of saying and asking ourselves how much time are we going to spend on this, or how long will this take. We basically ask how much are we willing to spend, basically. So we constrain, we use time to constrain what we want to actually build, and make those trade-offs with that time constraint. Is that right, Ryan?
Yeah, that's the shift in perspective. And
Yeah.
the reason that we do that is because it means then that we're starting to get into a negotiation between what is valuable to the business, how much time is this thing really worth, and then we can push and pull back and forth on, okay, well, given that this is kind of the window of time that we have, or this is, the team is going to be free for this many weeks before they have to do this other thing. What can we do inside of that time? That's just a very different question. It's
Yeah.
a creative problem, actually, right? Versus here's the Figma file. How long is it going to take?
Absolutely. So you mentioned, okay, so let's shape the work. Let's say, let's give ourselves 6 weeks, and let's shape something that we know will be valuable after 6 weeks. Do you brainstorm and define somehow the outcomes you want to achieve before you start getting into kind of ideation of the outputs, basically? Or how do you approach that combination of outcome and then shaping the work?
That's a great question. You asked about this third element of betting that the book talks
Right.
about. And this is a place where actually we were so close to the way that we were working when I was still inside of 37 Signals that we didn't even know how to explain this when I put the book out. And so the chapter on betting has a lot of kind of more the philosophy of how we want to not have more than one hard commitment at a time, and kind of how do we use the next 6 weeks that are available if we're working in 6 week cycles the way that 37 Signals was. But what I've learned from working with, now there are hundreds and hundreds of teams doing shape up out there in the real world now, and what I've learned is that, well, the real world is a bit different than inside of 37 Signals in a few ways. and actually, so it's not even that it's not only that it's different, it's also that there were just things that I couldn't see from the inside. And now, when we look back on it, so I present it in the book as if we're going to somehow do this shaping, and we're going to somehow have an appetite, and we're going to say this is a 6 week project and whatever. And then after it's shaped, we're going to bring this to a betting table, and we're going to decide, like, is this actually going to be something that we're going to dedicate the time and go do, right? In reality, the betting table is a little too late to be deciding if we're going to invest our time in shaping something. So really what was happening is that there was an understanding that we had before shaping something that this is actually the thing that's going to be most important next. And this is the thing that we probably need to figure out so that we can start building this soon, right? And then the betting table, the kind of making the bet after it was shaped, was more like the green light. You know what I mean? Like putting that last stamp on it to say, yes, we managed to shape it. This is something that we believe is going to be successful. Let's do it. But the real decision to invest time into it actually happened before the shaping. And this we now call framing.
Okay.
So framing is, what is the problem that matters most right now, or where is the opportunity that we want to spend time on? How is this problem or this opportunity more important than all these other things that we've been talking about? What is the right time to do this thing? And how big is it, and how much time do we want to invest in it? So those questions that you asked, really, really great question about when we're shaping, is it output? Is it outcome? This kind of a thing. we can tease these apart and we can say that the framing step is where we get clarity around the outcome that we want and the fact that there's a real problem. So
Yes.
customers are asking about, you know what I mean, this feature request. Why are they asking that? What does it mean? So this is sometimes, this word discovery is used in so many ways today that it can be hard to know kind of specifically what it means. But I know that some people, when they say discovery, they're referring to this kind of work, which is, let's say, the more business-oriented, customer-oriented kind of strategic work of, do we understand the problem? Do we really understand what it would mean to fix it? How would we know if it was better or worse? All those kind of questions are actually in the framing side. And then if we have something framed and we say, we believe this is a real problem, or an opportunity, we believe this is the most important thing to be doing next, we believe it's worth this much time, then we can say, okay, can we come up with something that we think we can actually do about it? Right? So that would be then bringing it into a shaping session. And you mentioned, kind of this 6-week rhythm, and that was an important rhythm inside of 37 Signals. What I've learned is that this is not essential to be on a 6-week rhythm. The key thing is if we want to have a fixed time box, whether it's 6 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 weeks, the question to ask ourselves is, how do I know that if I make a commitment and put some work into that box, that it's actually going to be finished at the end and it's going to be what we wanted, right? So that's how we kind of work backward to the shaping. And then if I'm shaping something, as you mentioned, well, how do I know if it's doing what it's supposed to do? How do I evaluate that shaped work? Well, we need to have some kind of a sense of what the outcome is. What is the itch that we're trying to scratch? What's the struggle that we're trying to resolve? And then we can call that the framing work.
Yeah.
And in general, the framing is the thing that has to come first, because that's where the alignment of resources happens. That's where we say, yeah, we agree this is important. Let's work on this instead of that. And then in practice, there, as you know, like working in product, once you get into the shaping session, there can be this kind of a little bit of back and forth between the shaping and framing, because you start to design a solution and then you get some clearer questions about what the problem really is. So there can be a little bit of back and forth there. But also about the 6-week thing, I just wanted to mention that for so many teams who are doing, let's say, kind of typical, software for businesses and not doing groundbreaking research or science projects, shaping doesn't mean 6 weeks of shaping before you go into a 6-week cycle. It more often means 2 or 3 very intense work sessions. So like 3 hours here, a little bit of spiking, coming back for another 3 hours, and then like, okay, we've got it. And now we've got something that we can give a team to work on for the next 4 weeks or something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. The whole layer of framing that it seems that you added that later after kind of more reflection and hearing folks how they were applying Shape Up. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's like, okay, what is the problem that we want to solve? What evidence do we have that is the right problem? And so let's frame that opportunity. And there's a lot of different tools that folks are using right now, like opportunity solution trees from tutorials and so on, to kind of frame that landscape. And then once you decide kind of that, okay, this is an interesting opportunity to explore, or at least it's more interesting than B and C, so let's go for A. Then you start shaping the work, and you give yourself a constraint, whether it's 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. You mentioned that is less important. The most important thing is to reflect on what is a time frame that will allow us to ship some value that we can learn from.
Yeah.
But I do have there was a nuance there, because of course Parkinson's law hit, right? It kind of for those who are listening that might not know what Parkinson's law is that the work expands within the given time that is that it has. Sorry, I'm confused. It's how is it? It's the work.
Yeah, exactly as you said. The work expands to fill the time available. Exactly. So whatever time we say we have to do it, it for sure won't take less.
Exactly. So what's kind of the balance that you find there? Because of course, if you say, well, just reflect on the time that you need, the people will say, well, we need 2 months or 3 months. So how do you what's kind of an ideal time frame that you've seen that works for most teams, at least, that
Oh,
allows
I
them to
don't think
balance this?
I haven't seen that problem recently. I think maybe we saw that problem in the ZERP years more, in the zero interest rate years.
Yeah,
But that's not the problem people are facing today. Nobody is saying, "Oh, you want 2 months? Sure, work on it for 2 months." I mean, what we are
yeah,
seeing is the opposite. It's always a challenge
yeah.
when we really are talking about making time investments, and we need to have the sales has to be aligned with what the engineering priorities are, and the CEO has to be aligned with the CTO. I mean, when we really talk about what are we actually doing here, there's so much time pressure.
Yeah,
Of course, like we always have, there's always this feeling that there's not enough time, and there's a million things that everybody wants us to do, and it's really hard. That's why I think we're seeing a lot of interest in Shape Up these days, is because we're talking about this, and that people are looking for some tools they can use to say, how do I deal with this now? I'm under way more pressure than I ever was to actually get stuff out the door to finish things, because
yeah,
we have to be delivering.
exactly. Okay, so then that's shaping. Now, the obvious question that probably people are thinking is, okay, but who shapes the work then, and who builds the work? Is it the same team? So let's say most of my listeners are, product people. They're particularly in Europe and Scandinavia, and particularly in Norway. And of course, more and more people are now trying to either transform to the product operating model, or somehow they have adopted some of the principles from the product operating model. Others are trying to run some transformations aligned with some of the principles, like outcomes over outputs and so on. And you have product leadership, and you have product teams. And there's this debate on, okay, is shaping, or sorry, framing, would that be product leadership primarily dealing with together with the teams, or kind of in your book is the teams only? Like how do you differentiate who does what in Shape Up, and what do you believe is more effective?
So the first thing I think that really helps us is to look at these words, shaping, framing. They're just describing different kinds of work, you know, and that work kind of needs to happen somehow, and we're just giving it names. And if we don't shape it all, and we just say, oh, we're going to go build according to some bullet points that are written in a brief, then of course we get a lot of problems, right? Because we don't know what it is that we're building, and then the time is dragging, and then we're doing a lot of rework and backtracking and all that kind of thing. So when you are inside of a team, then the opportunity here is to start to use this language and these ideas to make sense out of what you're seeing in front of your nose, like what's going on here, right? So there's one more concept, or maybe term, that we can use, which is the idea of a time bomb. So we all know the experience of being inside of a delivery cycle, and we thought everything was going to go smoothly, or we at least hoped, that something was going to go okay. And then
Yeah,
all of a sudden, like, boom, oh, this is more complicated than we thought. This isn't possible the way that we thought it was. We're blocked on this person, and we didn't know that we would need them. You know what I mean? Like those things that happen that blow up, and then you can't finish on time because this unexpected thing kind of ruined the whole plan for the project, right? Those are time bombs. They've been ticking inside of that work since before kickoff, because we said yes to that work, right? And then all of a sudden, oh, we didn't realize that we also had to do that, or we didn't realize about this edge case or whatever, right? So if we think of those as ticking time bombs, then what we're going to want to do is, all of us experience things like that, So we're inside of a project, we're inside of a deadline, and something blew up that shouldn't have. So now what we can say is, where did that time bomb come from? When would have been a better time to somehow trigger that, so that we could know about it or bring it to the surface? So the whole idea of shaping is, if you're not having time bombs, then everything's fine, then you're just executing and executing and executing. But if you're having those problems coming up inside of your time boxes, then you can say, that's something we didn't look at clearly enough when we were shaping. Now, there's always going to be unexpected things. There's always going to be little things, but we should be mainly, I mean, again, if unless you are really doing some unusual research, most of us are building things that have been built before, kind of using known parts, you know? And if we should be 80%, you know, everything's running smooth, it's more or less on time, it's doing what it's supposed to do, no big surprises. That's because we're not doing rocket science. And so if that's not happening, then it means actually that there's things that were not questions we didn't ask, technical things that we didn't define, things that we didn't clarify before we started the clock. So that's the shaping work, right? And if you look at the nature of these time bombs, they are almost always, they have to do with technical things because we're trying to build something, right? Of course, we're trying to build something and now all of a sudden we have a problem. So it means it has to do with building. And so what you'll see is that as teams start to see that they need to shape better, it means more technical attention, more looking into the concrete details of what is it that we're actually building. So this shaping work, which before might have been only really dominated, let's say, by product and design, or really 90% product and design, becomes much more technical because we understand we have to know what we're getting into before we make a commitment to build it, right? So the shaping work becomes more technical than it was before. But then what's interesting is it creates this opportunity because when we shape a little bit better, then that means that fewer time bombs are exploding inside of the delivery cycle. When fewer time bombs are exploding, the product managers don't have to run around trying to fix everything, right? And what it means is that on the product side, we get more time. We get more time to focus on the strategic questions, which means then that our bandwidth increases for the framing work, which we always are talking about. You know, every product conference, it's basically like, how can we be taken more seriously by the business? And how can we be more strategic? And of course, the problem is that everyone is just running around all the time trying to put out the fires. And of course, there's no time to be strategic. Do you know what I mean? But now that we focus the shaping more on the technical aspect of what to build, then it means that product has an opportunity then, and actually also I think a little bit of a necessity, to be honest, to move leftward and to be able to contribute in terms of what are we spending our time on, what's important, what's next, what's not next, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I love that. And the way I see it with the context that is dominated in a lot of organizations is that product leaders and the teams, so let's say the trio at least, the so-called product trio, like the engineer, tech lead, design lead, and product manager, for example, they would work together on the framing. That's kind of how I interpret your work and what you're saying right now, Ryan. And then the trio at least will be responsible for the shaping, especially that tech lead there being very important. Because what usually happens is that, you know, back to your point on Figma file, beautiful Figma files that then reach the engineering team and then, well, it's not possible to build. Okay, well, that was waste, basically, a waste of time creating all that beautiful Figma file. And I've seen this happening in practice, and it's very disappointing for everyone. Yeah. But the opposite is also works, right? We can't just be engineering shaping the work because it lacks the business context and so on and so forth.
Of course.
So then you need the trio. That's basically kind of ideas that are circulating in the industry, like the product trio, you know, Teresa Torres and Kagan have been advocating for those things. But when I apply your lenses, like Shape Up, into this, it fits very well with so many different ideas. So the framing fits really well with product leadership that has kind of to negotiate with the teams what outcomes we want to achieve and why and what we're not going to do. Then we have shaping, with the product trio being together shaping the work that they're gonna do. And then we have betting. Product leadership comes in again to actually kind of help make the decision and unblock and coach. And then you have building. And now when we get to building, Ryan, one question I have for you is, I love the assigning kind of the, you call it the project, right? Kind of the assign the whole kind of thing that we're gonna build to the team, rather than, typical Scrum dividing everything into 200 useless tickets. But but something that comes up usually is when it comes to the putting out fires type work. The ticket system can be an interesting system to rely on. When it comes to very specific bugs or things like that, do you then combine those two systems, like ticket system and then a more broad project for bugs? How do you approach that?
Oh, good question. So tickets are the perfect tool for the job when you have a stakeholder holding the other end of the ticket with urgency. Every single customer support tool is ticket based, right?
Yeah.
And there's a good reason, because every time a customer contacts you, they're waiting, they're waiting for an answer. So there's that urgency with a stakeholder on the other end. The place where we get into trouble is that if we're trying to do project work and then we divide all that project into tickets, it's not a question that there's a fire burning on the other end. Do you know what I mean? Like the fact that we could say that there's a certain technical piece of work that has to happen, it doesn't mean that like this is now a big urgent crisis that we have to do this technical thing. What makes it urgent is the situation around it, So project work is very, very different from solving an urgent customer issue, fixing a infrastructure problem, you know what I mean, where there's an
Yeah.
outage or everything is suddenly very slow, or there's all kinds of reasons why you need tickets. But that's a different world from we carved out 6 weeks or even 6 months or whatever it is, or a year to build a project. You know, it's a different kind of work with very different steps and different challenges, and if we treat it all as tickets, then I mean we all know what that looks like, a million tickets everywhere, right? And we don't have to treat projects that way, and we can still use tickets for exactly what they're good for.
Okay, yeah, I think you're spot on again, and that truly resonates with me. I've never really understood why people spend so much time with tickets and writing user stories that need to be in this format, and finding very creative ways to align all of these things. And yet, if you have a team that is working, shaping the work together, that doesn't happen. And you don't need to translate user needs to anyone, because the people that were shaping the work were there. And it's easy to pass context if people know what they're going to build in general, and also allow for some creativity to flow instead of being very rigid in, hey, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. So I really like the philosophy behind it. But then, let's say that you have a tech lead, a product manager, and a design lead, and then you have, let's say, 3 developers. Do you then, assuming that you have a product out there and you're doing continuous discovery and you're shaping the work and then you're building, you're betting, you're shaping the work, you're building, you're betting, blah, blah, blah. And then some bugs come up and some technical debt comes up, and do you then allocate like one of the engineers to deal with it, more like the ticket type, bug type work, or do you kind of shift the whole engineering team to do that? How do you approach this usually in general?
So this is exactly the puzzle that every organization has to deal with, because there's going to be a certain flow of ticket kind of issues that actually do need to be answered urgently. There's going to be some amount of those things, right? And how many of those and what they are and what kind of work it involves, that's going to vary depending from team to team and organization to organization. There's going to be some companies that have a lot of weird tech debt and quality problems in a certain part of their app, and they might have to be doing a lot of um, let's say like technical, like reacting technically to stuff being broken for customers kind of all the time.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you're in a situation where a reality for you is customers experiencing things that are broken and they actually do need some work done in reaction to those tickets on an ongoing basis, then from a standpoint of planning how we use time as a team or as an organization, then we have to figure that out, right? So so this is a capacity planning question. How do we dedicate or reserve capacity for this urgent reactive kind of work? And then how do we dedicate capacity for the focused project strategic work? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. So, if you're a team of three, of course, that's going to look different than if you're in a company of 3,000 also. If you're a team
Yeah.
of three, everybody has to do everything anyway. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But what we see is sometimes we see so you can think of it as like two channels. And these two channels, they have their own process, their own tools, their own way of working. The people doing project work are in more of a shape up inspired way of working. They're not ticket based, they're based on shaped work. But the people who are on the reactive track, I mean, of course, they're going to be ticket based and they're going to be dealing with issue after issue after issue. And what you might see is you might have kind of two different teams and they're running in parallel because there's enough work that it kind of needs a full-time reactive group. You might see a rotation of, okay, this person is going to be on reactive sort of on-call duty for the next 4 weeks while these other people are building something. And then at the end of the 4 weeks, maybe we're going to have a cool down and then switch or something like that. You see some teams they budget in 1 or 2 days per week for doing reactive things. It all depends on kind of analyzing where is that reactive work coming from, whose time does it need, you know, what, how much of that is truly necessary and not. And then when we look at what's left, the truly necessary work, well, how do we allocate somebody's time so that we can kind of know that we're planning to spend that much time on that kind of work, right? And then what we can do is we can adjust our time box for the strategic work accordingly so that we know what we're shaping into. And if it's all mixed together, then of course it's frustrating. But if we just pull it apart in whatever way is appropriate for our team and our org, then we know what we're working with and we can be strategic about it.
Absolutely. Well said. Indeed, the puzzle that many organizations have to deal with, especially scale-ups that are growing really, really fast. Ryan, before we wrap up, there's one thing you said before that I think is really interesting. I would love for you to unpack it and elaborate a little bit. You mentioned a few months ago, and I'm going to quote, "I'm starting to think product management will be overtaken by product engineering. Engineers are learning product, but PMs aren't learning how to build." I think this is a really interesting idea and reflection. What do you mean by this? Can you elaborate a little bit on what you meant?
Yeah, I think so. This concerns actually the shaping and the delivery side of the work, and I think we're already seeing this trend when it comes to getting stuff built. The more that there is pressure to deliver, the more people are insisting that we have technical knowledge and we're able to understand kind of what the real work is if we're involved in the building and the delivery side. And there's less of an appetite, I think, in the business environment right now, and just in generally, there's less of a tolerance of we're going to have kind of a lot of communication and management layers and stuff to help us with delivery. It's kind of like, no, we actually need to sink our teeth into the technical work more, right? I don't think that product management goes away or that product folks don't have a purpose anymore. Uh, what it means is that if we're going to, if we see ourselves as being in the product role and we want to contribute, I think just being someone who can conduct a ritual, or hold a meeting, or kind of make sure that we remember a lot of open issues and tap people's shoulders all the time, like that kind of thing is going to be less and less valuable. Uh, Now, the opportunity side of it is kind of what we talked about earlier, that the need to more clearly define outcomes, to negotiate time, to decide like what we're spending time on now versus next, or all those different kinds of things. That framing work remains very, very important, and it's still very, very fuzzy. So if I think if someone wants to really add value as a product person, there's a kind of a little bit of a fork in the road appearing right now. This is kind of like a moment we're in where if we just want to be the communication person, then I think there's going to be less and less opportunity. But we can either turn right and become more technical and get more involved in the shaping, or we can turn left and focus more on learning about what's important in the business and really being effective in terms of defining problems and opportunities and stuff like that.
I really like that, and I agree that there has been this trend, starting many years ago on basically product being, it's a typical Scrum PO, basically. Product being the administrator of building instead of being a key role in framing and shaping. And I agree with you that product management should be a key role in framing and shaping, and not an administrator of building.
Right.
And yeah.
It would be very healthy, for example, to be getting that clear understanding of what the problem is, being there to set kind of the constraints when shaping, so that we know that this is indeed hitting the points of what's valuable, and then coming in for very high value sessions during delivery where there's moments for demo and review, right? And really having then an intensive kind of, an intense work session where we're really saying, is this doing what the customer needs according to what we understood and what we shaped and that kind of a thing. And that's very different from, as you said, kind of being an administrator, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now that's what great product management is all about, contributing with viability. Is this viable for the business? And then design, super important on desirability and usability. And there's usually an overlap with product and design on desirability, which I think is healthy. And then the tech lead or engineers with the feasibility, but actually everyone being responsible for shipping something that is extremely valuable for the customers and for the company. So I think having that collaborative mindset is important, and everybody should be able to bring really important points to the table. Ryan, before we wrap up, one last question, and this is not related to Shape Up, it's actually related to something you seem to have done, it's my assumption. You have mentors.
Okay.
You have
Yes.
I assume you have many mentors, but I know at least you have Jason. You've mentioned before Jason, and I know Bob Moesta. He's actually been on the podcast as well. So I want you to share a bit more on this journey of yours to find mentors and the importance of mentors for you, and if you have any tips for people that are listening, like how important was for you and your growth to have mentors, and how should people find these people in their life?
Everything that has happened for me professionally has been because of mentors. Actually, I think everything in general that's been good in my life has been from finding people who were ahead of me and who knew better than I did and had more experience than I did, and trying to tune into them. If you listen to how really good musicians talk, they will tell you about the musicians they look up to, right? And they listen to those records over and over again and really tried to take pieces of that into their technique and so on. And I think that all kind of our skills and everything it's just like that. When I first started in web design, I thought web design was cool. I was really interested, and Jason's work really stood out to me as special. I really liked what he was doing, And I was really excited about Jacob Nielsen's work on the original useit.com website, which used to be a very unique, totally unique looking thing. And Edward Tufte's work, there were people who I looked up to as like my heroes. These were the people who were doing really great work, and I wanted to be more like them, and I wanted to learn from them. And then I was lucky that Jason saw potential in me, and we also had enough chemistry to work together. And then I was able to learn a lot from him. And then when I remember the first time I heard Bob on a podcast, and I was like, oh, this guy, he's talking about so many things that I already kind of thought were important. But I can see that he's figured out more of it than I have, or he's put it together in a way like there's a lot I can learn there. And we had a dinner, and it was a combination of the openness and interest from my side. And of course, there's also, the aspect of friendship and chemistry and all of that. So I think that sometimes people hear mentor and they turn it into some kind of an artificial or, kind of formal kind of relationship. Like, will you be my mentor? And I think mentor is really only a word that you can use when you look back. You can't ask someone to be my mentor, but you can admire someone and see a lot of quality in what they're doing. And you can try to strike up a relationship as someone who appreciates and wants to learn. And if there's some exchange there, then after some growth has happened, then we look back on that and we say, oh, that was that was a mentor to me.
Exactly. Love it. Ryan, it was so great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure you subscribe to my newsletter so you don't miss out, and see you next time.